There is such an obsession with training girls to be wives. And I think we really need to dissect this and the invisible contracts connected to this obsession that a lot of adults have, of all genders, by the way, with training, okay, and basically raising their girls to become wives in the future. And this is a big problem, and it has some real downsides for a lot of women when they reach adulthood. And for example, they become disappointed or frustrated because they are single. We have essentially guided young girls into thinking that any personal development work that they do and any decisions that they're making in life are in lieu of becoming a wife one day. Now, here's the thing. The problem is not teaching girls kindness, responsibility, hopefully emotional regulation, domestic kind of competence, right? Because all adults need to be able to look after themselves. They need to be hygienic. They need to be able to feed themselves and live in a clean environment. That is true regardless of gender. It's it's an adult natural evolution and developmental stage that we would expect to occur. Same too when it comes to certain relational skills. There's no problem with training children, specifically girls, to develop those skills and value those skills, because in my view, those are human competencies. However, a problem does begin to emerge when those qualities are framed primarily as evidence that a girl will be useful one day, she will be desirable, and she will be chosen by a man to be his wife. That is not neutral preparation for life, okay? And actually what what that is evidence of is this very early socialization of female identity around being chosen. And this is one of the reasons why when I see, a lot of women in particular, online and offline, defending, for example, their desire to get married and marriage, is often identity level deep. And you will hear certain phrases come from their mouths. Everybody wants to be with someone. No one wants to be alone. Everyone desires partnership. Okay. And on the surface, those statements seem to be very reasonable, but actually there is an identity level deep reason why there is such a defensiveness quite often, a kind of visceral reaction when singleness is being spoken about and when marriage is being discussed, often in not so favorable ways. I see this all of the time. It's really funny actually, because right now there's like a viral clip going around where a podcast host said that only broke women desired to get married. I found it fascinating to see some of the responses online, but equally as well, when that viral article was written by Shantae Joseph, the UK-based journalist, around is having a boyfriend embarrassing in Vogue, the discourse that emerged after that, very revealing as well. The level of defense that women who are in relationships, women who desire relationships had. It's not simply about being a human being who desires companionship and partnership, because we know that there is no scientific evidence, for example, that not getting married, specifically women not marrying men, is going to put you in a life or death situation, right? However, it can feel like that in the nervous system. A lot of women experience grief and sorrow. They experience identity level insecurity and shame when they are not partnered, when they are single. And so when you see a lot of these women talking online and saying, it's not right to say that some women just desire marriage, those desires have not emerged in a vacuum. Is there an element of human beings that desire companionship and partner? Yes, but that can be found outside of marriage. And women can find that outside of marriage to men. In fact, when you look historically, and even in the present day, a lot of women, their companionship and partnership needs, and this includes partnered women, come from their friendships and family relationships. It doesn't all come from the man that they are married to. And so there's an identity level deep piercing that happens, okay, when women who have been conditioned and programmed to prepare themselves for a husband, prepare themselves to be chosen by a man to become his wife. When that doesn't happen, when it feels like it's not going to happen, there's an identity level deep rupture. Okay, that is why we see so many women defending the decision they've made, for example, to marry. We see this, it comes up in various different ways. Defending their desire to marry in the first place, which, by the way, you don't have to defend any desires, whatever they are. But my point is, it often pulls people to do that because actually, intrinsically, they believe that that is the quintessential indicator of womanhood, that this is inextricably linked to womanhood, and that you are not truly fulfilling your potential. That's why you hear people refer to marriage as natural divine design, that this is the role of a wife. And I often am very unsettled and just disturbed sometimes when I hear parents talking about the fact that they are training their girls to be wives. And I find it also equally very interesting how, you know, a lot of the criticism that comes mostly from, you know, misogynistic people is that girls are no longer being trained to become wives. They're not being trained to value becoming somebody's wife. Why do you think we have all these conversations about trad wives? Okay, and whether or not an 18-year-old should be aspiring to simply become a man's wife and start having children and not go to college. I saw a young woman on TikTok. She described it as an opportunity. She's 18 and her boyfriend has said to her, you don't have to go to college. Marry me and you won't have to work. And she described that as an opportunity. She's 18, not even an adult yet, hasn't lived any adult life yet. But the values that she has been fed is that this is the route to fulfillment. This is the right route to fulfillment for girls. Okay? So we really have to understand what is happening here. As a human being, you're so much more than just a role, regardless of what that role is. And I fail to believe that as a human being who happens to be a woman, that your only role in life is to cook, clean, and procreate with and for a man. When you look at creation and nature, we've got hundreds of different types of fruits, seeds, nuts, trees. We don't even know what creatures live in the ocean, all of the creatures. We don't even know all of the creatures that exist in the sky. I fail to believe that with so much diversity in nature and creation itself, that the female human being was only designed, okay, to be nurtured from birth, to only be selected by a human male who is imperfect. He is not a god. To cook, clean, and give birth to his children. That is the height of fulfillment, the breadth and depth of who you could be as a human being. That is essentially what we're saying when you're saying that girls should be trained to be wives. And isn't it also interesting, though, that that level of training is believed to be needed? I find that interesting because if it was that natural, why isn't it something that girls naturally, without any external intervention, construction, remodeling, go into? It does require conditioning and programming. Arguably because it's not as natural as we're being led to believe that it is. It is not the only route to fulfillment. And conversely, what we see is that men are allowed to inhabit more than one role and expression in their lives. They're not forced to stick to just one expression and one vertical within which they can function and experience life. In fact, not all, I'm not saying all men, of course not, but when you look at men who are working in fields that they've always wanted to work in, they're doing things that they thoroughly enjoy. They're allowed to do that and they get rewarded financially. And yet it seems for women, you're being told that you have to make a choice. You either become somebody's wife and have their children, or Okay, you buck against divine natural design and you allow yourself to be creative, innovative. You allow yourself to add value to community and society. You allow yourself to solve problems for an employer or clients and be rewarded financially. It's always very telling to me when I hear misogynistic people say, why would you rather work for a boss and have a boss tell you what to do instead of your own husband? Either way, you're being viewed as property. Either way, you are being viewed as an asset. Because why would an adult human being who happens to be a woman need to choose a master? Why would you need to choose a master, a secular corporate master, or a man at home to be your master? Now, hear me well, I shouldn't have to say this. This is not an argument against marriage. What I'm saying here is becoming a wife cannot be the organizing principle for human beings who happen to be female. That can't be the organizing principle of a girl's identity before she's even had an opportunity and a chance to discover who she is, what she wants, what she desires, what talents and strengths and gifts does she have. In my view, it's very limiting, in fact, to train a girl to be a wife one day. Now, notice I'm talking about wife stuff, as it were, because I think motherhood has a slightly different category. Slightly different. Because motherhood, look, parenting is a profound responsibility and experience. And evidently that desire can exist outside of a desire to be partnered with a man, outside of a desire to marry a man. Yeah, people desire to become parents outside of those contexts and containers. And actually, arguably, the experience and the role goes far beyond whether or not a man chooses you to be his wife. Okay, I think it's fair to say that that's the case. Yes, people do choose to have children after getting married. Yes, there are lots of people, again, who prefer to procreate after getting married. But what I'm saying is that the parenting desire itself and the experience of parenting, can very much be looked at separately to being somebody's wife. And so that's why I don't put it in the same category. But I think what we do see commonly, though, is that the organizing principle is that you will become someone's wife one day. So you must dress like this, talk like this, think this, desire only these things. You've got to walk and quack like a duck so that this man that you've not even met yet, by the way, he will see you, notice you, and choose you to be his wife. And I think it's so important for women to value human development and personal development outside of becoming somebody's wife. What do I mean by that? It is worthy, it's worthwhile to learn how to regulate your own emotions, to care for yourself, to communicate well, to treat people with respect and dignity and ethically, to learn how to manage money. This is really important. How to maintain your own space and home, how to make decisions in your full authority, how to develop critical thinking skills, how to discern character, how to build and preserve. These are important things regardless of whether or not you're married. This is just adult behavior, okay? None of those competencies belong exclusively to being somebody's wife. But the problem that we have is that systems of power, which including culture, religion, family, have trained girls to believe you develop these things so that you get chosen. And you develop them so that you can make these skills available for use. It's about you being useful. That is the invisible contract there. It's about utility and availability of those skills and competencies within the context of marriage. Right? And so it's very important for us to be aware of this. Why would we be training young girls who should be living their life, discovering themselves, to only desire to be chosen by a man and become a man's wife? And let's just be very frank here. We know at the time of day that we're living in now, we know a lot more about the reality of being somebody's wife than we did before. It's far more openly discussed. and the veil is falling. The scales are falling from people's eyes. And so, why are we training girls to only aspire to be somebody's wife? You can be so much more than that. And I am being deliberate with those words. You can be so much more than that. Squirrels have got more freedom than women at this point. Your life belongs to you. And actually, if you're raising a daughter, her life belongs to her. And so training her to only think about becoming somebody's wife is very limiting. There's going to be so many beautiful gifts and traits and skills that she has that can be completely wasted, underdeveloped, never unlocked, where she could enjoy existing and being who she is. Because when you train a young girl to only want to be a wife, you're training her to be useful and therefore used. This is why I encourage you to really review and think about the invisible contracts that exist, okay, that govern women's lives. And you can do that in the Invisible Contract Audit Workbook, which is somewhere in the description.